You remember the exact moment it happened. You were sitting somewhere ordinary, maybe your childhood bedroom or the backseat of a car, when suddenly the world you thought you knew began to crack open like an eggshell. What you had believed without question for years suddenly seemed fragile, questionable, almost naive. The adults you trusted implicitly revealed themselves as fallible human beings, making it up as they went along. The simple answers to complex questions that once satisfied you now felt hollow and incomplete. This wasn't just growing up. This was something far more profound and infinitely more painful. You had entered what Jean Piaget called the most challenging transition in human cognitive development, a passage so difficult that many people spend their entire lives trying to navigate it, and some never complete it at all. The pain you felt during that transition wasn't accidental or unnecessary. It was the inevitable result of your brain reorganizing itself at the most fundamental level, dismantling the concrete operational thinking that had served you well throughout childhood, and constructing the abstract reasoning capabilities that would define your adult consciousness. Piaget spent decades documenting this transformation, watching as children around the world went through the same excruciating process of cognitive metamorphosis. What he discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The transition from concrete to formal operational thinking isn't just about learning new information or developing new skills. It's about fundamentally altering the way your mind processes reality itself. Most people assume that growing up is a gradual, linear process where you simply accumulate more knowledge and experience over time. They imagine that the difference between a child's mind and an adult's mind is primarily a matter of information storage, like upgrading from a smaller hard drive to a larger one. But Piaget's research revealed something far more complex and troubling. The human mind doesn't just grow larger as we mature. It undergoes complete structural reorganization that can be as disorienting and painful as any physical transformation. When you passed through this cognitive revolution, you didn't just learn new things about the world. You developed an entirely new way of thinking about thinking itself. The signs that you've successfully navigated this transition are subtle but unmistakable. They reveal themselves not in what you know, but in how you approach the very act of knowing. They show up in your relationship with uncertainty, your comfort with contradiction, and your ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without needing to immediately resolve them into a single, simple truth. These signs indicate that you've developed what Piaget called formal operational thinking, the highest level of cognitive development that most humans achieve. But reaching this level comes at a cost that few people fully understand or acknowledge. The journey through this transformation begins innocently enough, usually during early adolescence, when the brain starts rewiring itself for abstract reasoning. Piaget first observed this process in his own laboratory in Geneva, where he spent countless hours presenting children and teenagers with complex logical problems that required them to think about thinking itself. One of his most revealing experiments involved showing young people a pendulum and asking them to figure out what factors affected how fast it swung back and forth. Children in the concrete operational stage approached this systematically but concretely, testing one variable at a time in a straightforward manner. But something remarkable happened when adolescents who had entered formal operational thinking tackled the same problem. These older subjects didn't just test variables randomly or systematically. They began to think about all the possible combinations of variables that might be relevant, considering not just what was happening, but what could happen under different circumstances. They developed hypotheses about relationships they couldn't directly observe, and designed experiments to test abstract principles rather than concrete facts. Most significantly, they began to think about their own thinking process, analyzing their reasoning and questioning their assumptions in ways that younger children simply couldn't manage. This metacognitive awareness marked the beginning of their entry into formal operational thinking, but it also marked the beginning of a profound and often painful shift in how they experience the world. The first sign that you've passed through this cognitive transformation is that you've developed an almost uncomfortable awareness of your own mental processes. You catch yourself thinking about how you think, questioning why you believe what you believe, and analyzing the logic behind your own reasoning. This metacognitive awareness can be both liberating and exhausting. Suddenly nothing is simple anymore because you're constantly aware of the complexity underlying even basic thoughts and decisions. Where a concrete operational thinker might say, "I believe this because it's true," you find yourself saying, "I believe this because of these specific reasons, but I recognize that my reasoning might be flawed or incomplete." This newfound awareness often brings with it a second sign of cognitive maturation that can be particularly difficult to navigate. You begin to experience what Piaget called cognitive conflict on a regular basis. This isn't just disagreeing with other people or encountering new information that challenges your existing beliefs. It's the internal experience of holding contradictory ideas simultaneously and feeling the tension between them without immediately rushing to resolve that tension. You become capable of understanding that two seemingly opposite things can both be true, depending on context, perspective, or level of analysis. This cognitive flexibility is a hallmark of formal operational thinking, but it can make you feel constantly unsettled as you navigate a world that no longer offers the comfort of simple, absolute truths. Piaget documented this phenomenon extensively through his work with adolescents who were grappling with moral and ethical questions. He presented them with scenarios that had no clear right or wrong answers and watched as they struggled to navigate the complexity. What he found was that young people who had developed formal operational thinking could understand multiple perspectives on the same issue simultaneously, even when those perspectives contradicted each other. They could see how the same action might be morally justified from one viewpoint and morally problematic from another. This ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously is cognitively sophisticated, but it can be emotionally and psychologically challenging because it eliminates the certainty and simplicity that characterizes earlier stages of cognitive development. The third sign that you've successfully navigated this transformation becomes apparent in how you handle uncertainty and ambiguity. Rather than finding uncertainty deeply disturbing or rushing to eliminate it through oversimplified explanations, you've learned to be comfortable with not knowing. You can sit with questions that don't have clear answers, problems that don't have simple solutions, and situations that require you to act despite incomplete information. This comfort with uncertainty isn't resignation or apathy. It's a sophisticated understanding that uncertainty is often the most honest and accurate response to complex situations. This comfort with uncertainty often manifests in your relationship with authority and expertise as well, where concrete operational thinkers tend to view authority figures as either completely right or completely wrong. You've developed a more nuanced understanding of expertise. You can appreciate someone's knowledge and experience in a particular area while simultaneously recognizing the limitations of their perspective. You don't automatically accept or reject information based on its source, but rather evaluate it based on the quality of reasoning and evidence supporting it. This critical thinking ability is one of the most valuable outcomes of formal operational development, but it can also make you feel isolated from people who still rely primarily on authority or tradition to guide their thinking. At this point in your journey of understanding these cognitive transformations, I want to pause and acknowledge something important. If you're recognizing yourself in these descriptions, if you're remembering your own painful transition from the certainty of childhood to the complexity of adult thinking, you're not alone in that experience. The process Piaget described isn't just an abstract psychological theory. It's a deeply personal journey that millions of people have traveled, often feeling confused and isolated along the way. What you experienced during that transition, the moments when everything you thought you knew seemed to crumble, that confusion and pain you felt as your mind reorganized itself, those experiences are valid and significant. They represent nothing less than your consciousness evolving to a higher level of sophistication and capability. I'm curious about your own experience with this transformation. Can you remember a specific moment when you realized that the simple answers you'd been given as a child weren't sufficient anymore? When you first became aware that adults didn't actually have everything figured out, that the world was far more complex and uncertain than you'd been led to believe? If that moment stands out in your memory, leave a comment with just this phrase, "I remember when everything became complicated." Your willingness to share that memory might be exactly what someone else needs to read today, to realize they're not alone in having gone through this challenging but necessary evolution of consciousness. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do for others is simply acknowledge that we've walked the same difficult path. The fourth sign that you've passed through this cognitive transformation reveals itself in your relationship with hypothetical thinking and abstract reasoning. You find yourself naturally considering what-if scenarios, not just for practical planning purposes, but as a way of exploring ideas and understanding complex systems. You can think about situations that don't exist, consider the logical implications of premises you don't necessarily believe, and reason through abstract principles without needing concrete examples to anchor your thinking. This ability to engage in pure abstract reasoning is one of the hallmarks of formal operational thinking that Piaget identified as emerging during adolescence and continuing to develop throughout adulthood. Piaget's experiments with hypothetical reasoning revealed just how dramatic this cognitive shift really is. He would present children and adolescents with logical problems that required them to reason from premises that were obviously false or abstract. For example, he might say, "If all flowers are blue and roses are flowers, what color are roses?" Children in the concrete operational stage often struggled with these problems because they would get distracted by the fact that flowers aren't actually blue. They had difficulty separating the logical structure of the problem from their real-world knowledge about flowers. But adolescents who had developed formal operational thinking could easily set aside their real-world knowledge and follow the logical implications of the given premises, even when those premises contradicted reality. This capacity for abstract reasoning extends far beyond academic exercises. It underlies your ability to understand complex social and political issues, to engage with philosophical questions, to appreciate metaphorical and symbolic thinking, and to plan for long-term goals that require you to envision future scenarios that don't yet exist. When you can read a work of fiction and understand the symbolic meanings underlying the literal plot, when you can engage with philosophical concepts like justice or freedom without needing concrete examples, when you can consider the long-term implications of current decisions, you're demonstrating the abstract reasoning capabilities that Piaget identified as the pinnacle of cognitive development. The fifth sign becomes apparent in how you approach problem-solving and decision-making. You've developed what Piaget called systematic experimentation in your thinking. When faced with complex problems, you don't just try random solutions or rely on trial and error. You can mentally work through multiple possible approaches, consider the potential outcomes of each approach, and design strategies for testing your hypotheses systematically. This isn't just about being organized or methodical. It's about being able to think through complex causal relationships and design mental experiments to test your understanding. Piaget observed this systematic approach to problem-solving most clearly in his experiments with scientific reasoning. He would present adolescents with complex physical systems and ask them to figure out how they worked. What he found was that young people who had developed formal operational thinking approached these problems very differently from younger children. They would generate multiple hypotheses about what might be happening, design tests to distinguish between these hypotheses, and systematically work through the logical implications of their findings. They could think about variables they couldn't directly observe and reason about abstract relationships between different factors in the system. This systematic approach to thinking shows up in many areas of life beyond formal scientific reasoning. You might notice it in how you approach complex decisions, breaking them down into component parts and considering multiple factors simultaneously. You might see it in how you analyze relationships, considering not just what's happening on the surface, but trying to understand the underlying dynamics and patterns. You might recognize it in how you approach learning new skills or understanding new concepts, naturally looking for underlying principles and connections rather than just memorizing facts or procedures. The sixth sign of this cognitive transformation is perhaps the most socially challenging. You've developed what Piaget called relativistic thinking about truth, morality, and knowledge itself. This doesn't mean you've become a moral relativist who believes that anything goes. Rather, you've come to understand that truth and knowledge are often contextual, that what counts as valid reasoning or evidence can depend on the domain you're working in, and that many important questions don't have single, absolute answers that apply in all situations. This understanding can make you seem wishy-washy or indecisive to people who are still operating primarily from concrete operational thinking. They want clear, definitive answers to complex questions. Hand your tendency to qualify your statements, acknowledge uncertainty, and consider multiple perspectives can be frustrating for them. But this apparent indecisiveness isn't actually a weakness or lack of conviction. It's a sophisticated understanding of the complexity inherent in most important questions and situations. Piaget documented how this relativistic thinking develops through his studies of moral reasoning in adolescents and young adults. He found that young people who had developed formal operational thinking could understand that moral judgments often depend on context, intention, and consequences in complex ways. They could see how the same action might be morally justified in one situation and morally problematic in another. They could understand that different ethical frameworks might lead to different conclusions about the same situation, and that this didn't necessarily mean that one framework was right and the other was wrong. The seventh and final sign that you've passed through this transformation is the most profound and, in many ways, the most difficult to live with. You've developed what could be called existential awareness, a deep understanding of the fundamental uncertainties and limitations that characterize human existence. You understand that you will never have complete knowledge about anything important, that you will always be operating with incomplete information, and that many of the most significant questions about life, meaning, and purpose may not have definitive answers that can be discovered through reason alone. This existential awareness often brings with it a profound sense of both humility and responsibility. You understand that your perspective is limited and that others may see things that you miss. At the same time, you recognize that you have to make important decisions and take meaningful action despite these limitations. You can't wait for perfect knowledge or complete certainty before living your life. But you also can't pretend that your current understanding is complete or final. Piaget observed this existential dimension of formal operational thinking in his later work, when he began to focus more on questions of meaning and purpose rather than just logical reasoning. He found that people who had fully developed formal operational thinking often went through a period of existential questioning that could be deeply unsettling. They would question not just specific beliefs or pieces of knowledge, but the very possibility of certain knowledge itself. They would grapple with questions about the meaning and purpose of existence that had no clear, logical answers. This existential awareness can be the most isolating aspect of cognitive maturity. People around you may seem content with simple answers to complex questions, comfortable with certainties that now seem naive to you, satisfied with explanations that feel incomplete or superficial. You may find yourself feeling disconnected from conversations and activities that once felt meaningful, not because you've become cynical or superior, but because your mind now naturally seeks depth and complexity in ways that can't be turned off or ignored. The research Piaget conducted in his later years revealed something both encouraging and sobering about this final stage of cognitive development. He found that people who successfully navigate all these transformations often experience what he called wisdom integration, a capacity to hold all of these complex awareness simultaneously without being paralyzed by them. They learn to act decisively despite uncertainty, to commit deeply to relationships and causes despite understanding their limitations, and to find meaning and purpose despite acknowledging the fundamental mysteries that surround human existence. But this integration doesn't happen automatically or easily. It requires a conscious effort to synthesize the various capabilities that formal operational thinking provides. You have to learn to use your metacognitive awareness, your comfort with uncertainty, your abstract reasoning abilities, your systematic thinking, your relativistic understanding, and your existential awareness in service of living a meaningful and productive life, rather than allowing them to paralyze you with endless questioning and analysis. The most remarkable thing about this entire developmental process is that it continues throughout adulthood. Even after you've developed all the basic capabilities of formal operational thinking, you can continue to refine and integrate these abilities in more sophisticated ways. You can learn to apply systematic thinking to domains you haven't explored before. You can develop greater comfort with uncertainty in areas where you previously needed clear answers. You can become more skilled at holding multiple perspectives simultaneously without losing your ability to take meaningful action. Piaget's final studies focused on what he called post-formal operational thinking, cognitive capabilities that can develop beyond the basic formal operational stage. These involve even greater comfort with paradox and contradiction, more sophisticated understanding of the limits of logical reasoning, and enhanced ability to integrate rational and intuitive ways of knowing. People who develop these post-formal capabilities often report feeling more at peace with the uncertainties and complexities that once caused them distress, not because they've found simple answers, but because they've learned to dance with complexity rather than trying to eliminate it. The journey from concrete operational to formal operational thinking, with all its pain and difficulty, represents one of the most significant accomplishments of human development. It's the transition that allows you to engage with complex ideas, to think critically about important issues, to appreciate beauty and meaning in abstract concepts, and to navigate the uncertainties of adult life with some degree of grace and effectiveness. The signs that you've made this transition successfully aren't just markers of cognitive development. They're indicators that you've developed the mental tools necessary to engage fully with the complexity and richness of human existence, even when that engagement requires you to live with questions that may never be fully answered. The complexity of this developmental achievement becomes even more apparent when you consider the specific mechanisms through which it occurs. Piaget discovered that the transition to formal operational thinking doesn't happen all at once or in isolation. It emerges through what he called disequilibration, a process where your existing cognitive structures become inadequate for dealing with new challenges and must be reorganized at a fundamental level. This reorganization is inherently destabilizing because it requires you to temporarily abandon cognitive frameworks that have served you well throughout childhood. One of Piaget's most illuminating case studies involved a 14-year-old girl named Marie, whom he observed over several months as she grappled with increasingly complex logical problems. At the beginning of his observations, Marie approached problems in a straightforward, concrete manner. When presented with a chemistry experiment involving colorless liquids that could be combined to produce colored solutions, she systematically tried different combinations until she found ones that worked. Her approach was methodical, but limited to testing what was directly observable. But something remarkable happened over the course of several weeks. Marie began to show signs of frustration with her concrete approach. She would complete the assigned task successfully, but seemed dissatisfied with her solutions. When Piaget asked her to explain her thinking, she began to express awareness that there might be underlying principles she wasn't grasping. She started to question not just which combinations worked, but why they worked. This questioning marked the beginning of her transition into formal operational thinking, but it also marked the beginning of a period of cognitive turbulence that lasted several months. During this transition period, Marie exhibited all the signs of cognitive disequilibrium that Piaget identified as characteristic of major developmental leaps. She became more irritable and seemed less confident in her abilities. Tasks that had once felt straightforward now seemed complicated and uncertain. She would start problems with enthusiasm, but become frustrated when her usual approaches didn't feel adequate. Most tellingly, she began to express doubt about her own thinking process, asking questions like, "How do I know if I'm thinking about this correctly? And what if there's a better way to approach this that I'm not seeing?" This period of uncertainty and self-doubt wasn't a sign that Marie was regressing or struggling academically. It was evidence that her mind was reorganizing itself to accommodate more sophisticated ways of thinking. The frustration she felt was the inevitable result of trying to use concrete operational thinking to solve problems that required formal operational capabilities. Her growing awareness of the limitations of her current approach was actually a sign of emerging metacognitive abilities that would eventually allow her to think about thinking itself. The transformation that Marie underwent illustrates why this developmental transition is so psychologically challenging. It's not just that you're learning new information or developing new skills, You're literally rewiring the fundamental structures through which you process reality. The cognitive frameworks that once provided certainty and clarity become inadequate. But the new frameworks haven't yet stabilized enough to provide reliable guidance. You're caught between two ways of thinking, no longer satisfied with the simplicity of concrete operations, but not yet comfortable with the complexity of formal operations. This liminal state can persist for months or even years, creating what Piaget called cognitive vertigo. You find yourself questioning things you once took for granted, feeling uncertain about conclusions that once seemed obvious, and struggling to communicate with people who are still operating primarily from concrete operational thinking. The world becomes simultaneously more interesting and more difficult to navigate. You can see complexities and possibilities that others miss. But this enhanced perception comes at the cost of the comfortable certainty that characterized your earlier cognitive development. What makes this transition even more challenging is that it often occurs during adolescence, when you're already dealing with significant physical, social, and emotional changes. The cognitive transformation that Piaget documented doesn't happen in isolation from these other developmental processes. Instead, it interacts with them in complex ways that can amplify both the benefits and the difficulties of this period of life. Your emerging capacity for abstract reasoning allows you to think about identity, relationships, and future possibilities in more sophisticated ways. But it also makes you more aware of the uncertainties and contradictions that characterize these domains. The social implications of this cognitive transformation are particularly profound. As you develop formal operational thinking, you begin to see through social conventions and cultural assumptions that you previously accepted without question. You become aware that many of the rules and expectations that govern social behavior are arbitrary human constructions rather than natural laws. This awareness can be liberating because it opens up possibilities for thinking independently about social and moral questions. But it can also be isolating because it sets you apart from people who still rely primarily on social consensus or traditional authority to guide their thinking and behavior. Piaget's longitudinal studies revealed that the people who navigate this transition most successfully are those who learn to embrace what he called productive uncertainty. Rather than seeing their growing awareness of complexity and ambiguity as a problem to be solved, they learn to view it as an expanded capacity for understanding the world in more nuanced and sophisticated ways. They develop what might be called cognitive courage, the willingness to engage with difficult questions even when those questions don't have simple or definitive answers. This cognitive courage manifests itself in multiple domains of life. In relationships, it allows you to appreciate the complexity of other people without needing to categorize them as simply good or bad, compatible or incompatible. You can understand that someone might be kind in some contexts and selfish in others, that they might have admirable qualities alongside significant flaws, and that your relationship with them might be valuable despite its limitations. This nuanced understanding of human nature is one of the most practical benefits of formal operational thinking, but it requires you to give up the simpler, more categorical ways of thinking about people that characterize earlier stages of development. In your professional life, cognitive courage allows you to tackle complex problems that don't have predetermined solutions. You can work effectively in situations where the goals are ambiguous, the methods are uncertain, and the outcomes are unpredictable. You can collaborate with people who have different perspectives and approaches without needing everyone to agree before moving forward. You can make decisions with incomplete information and adjust your approach as new information becomes available. These capabilities are increasingly valuable in a world that is becoming more complex and unpredictable, but they require a level of comfort with uncertainty that many people never develop. Perhaps most importantly, cognitive courage allows you to engage with existential questions about meaning, purpose, and values without becoming paralyzed by their inherent uncertainty. You can commit to relationships, causes, and beliefs while simultaneously acknowledging that your understanding of these commitments may evolve over time. You can live with passion and conviction while maintaining intellectual humility about the limitations of your perspective. This balance between commitment and openness is one of the hallmarks of psychological maturity, and it emerges directly from the cognitive transformations that Piaget documented. The case of Marie, whom we encountered earlier, illustrates this beautifully. When Piaget followed up with her several years later, he found that she had successfully integrated her formal operational capabilities into a coherent approach to life. She had learned to use her enhanced cognitive abilities not to eliminate uncertainty and complexity, but to navigate them more skillfully. She approached new challenges with confidence in her ability to figure things out, even when she didn't have predetermined answers. She maintained close relationships while respecting the autonomy and complexity of other people. She pursued meaningful goals while remaining open to new information and perspectives that might require her to adjust her approach. Most remarkably, Marie reported that the period of cognitive turbulence she had experienced during her transition to formal operational thinking now seemed like one of the most valuable experiences of her life. She understood that the confusion and uncertainty she had felt weren't signs of failure or inadequacy, but evidence that her mind was expanding to accommodate more sophisticated ways of thinking. She had learned to view cognitive discomfort as a signal that she was growing rather than a problem that needed to be eliminated. This perspective on cognitive discomfort is one of the most important insights to emerge from Piaget's research. The pain and confusion that characterize the transition to formal operational thinking aren't unfortunate side effects of development that should be minimized or avoided. They're integral parts of the process through which your mind reorganizes itself to handle greater complexity. Learning to interpret cognitive discomfort as a sign of growth rather than a sign of problems can transform your relationship with learning and development throughout your adult life. The implications of this insight extend far beyond individual psychology. Piaget's research suggests that many of the problems we face as a society stem from the fact that complex challenges require formal operational thinking to address effectively, but many people never fully develop these capabilities or learn to apply them consistently. Issues like climate change, social inequality, and political polarization require the kind of systematic thinking, comfort with uncertainty, and ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously that characterize formal operational thinking. They can't be solved through the concrete operational approaches that focus on simple solutions and categorical thinking. This doesn't mean that people who haven't developed formal operational thinking are less valuable or important. Piaget was clear that different stages of cognitive development are appropriate for different life challenges, and concrete operational thinking remains essential for many practical tasks. But it does suggest that cultivating formal operational capabilities, both individually and collectively, is crucial for addressing the complex challenges that define our historical moment. The 7 signs that you've successfully navigated this transition represent more than just personal developmental achievements. They indicate that you've developed cognitive capabilities that allow you to contribute to collective problem-solving efforts in ways that purely concrete operational thinking cannot support. Your metacognitive awareness helps you recognize when your thinking might be biased or limited. Your comfort with uncertainty allows you to work effectively on problems that don't have predetermined solutions. Your abstract reasoning capabilities enable you to understand complex systems and relationships. Your systematic thinking helps you design effective approaches to multifaceted challenges. Your relativistic understanding prevents you from oversimplifying complex issues. Your existential awareness keeps you grounded in humility about the limitations of human knowledge. These capabilities become even more valuable when they're combined with what Piaget called decentration, the ability to consider multiple perspectives simultaneously without losing your own center. This isn't the same as relativism or the inability to take strong positions. Rather, it's the capacity to understand how other people might reasonably reach different conclusions while maintaining confidence in your own reasoning process. This decentered perspective allows you to engage in productive dialogue with people who disagree with you, to learn from perspectives that challenge your assumptions, and to modify your positions when presented with compelling evidence or reasoning. Looking back at that moment when everything first became complicated, when the simple certainties of childhood gave way to the complex uncertainties of adult consciousness, you can now understand it as the beginning of your emergence into the fullest expression of human cognitive potential. The pain you felt wasn't punishment for leaving behind childish thinking. It was the inevitable cost of developing the mental capabilities that allow you to engage fully with the richness and complexity of existence. The journey through cognitive development never really ends. Even after you've developed all the basic capabilities of formal operational thinking, you can continue to refine and integrate these abilities in more sophisticated ways. You can learn to apply systematic thinking to new domains, develop greater comfort with uncertainty in areas where you previously needed clear answers, and become more skilled at integrating rational and intuitive ways of knowing. The cognitive courage you've developed can continue to expand, allowing you to tackle increasingly complex challenges and engage with ever deeper questions about the nature of existence. If you've recognized yourself in these descriptions, if you felt the resonance of understanding your own painful but necessary cognitive transformation, then you've joined a community of people who are committed to engaging with life at its deepest and most complex levels. This isn't always an easy path, but it's one that offers profound rewards in terms of personal growth, meaningful relationships, and the ability to contribute to solutions for some of humanity's most pressing challenges. You don't have to walk this path alone. The cognitive capabilities you've developed, challenging as they can sometimes be to live with, are also the foundation for deep connections with others who are on similar journeys of growth and understanding. Your willingness to embrace uncertainty creates space for others to acknowledge their own uncertainties. Your comfort with complexity invites others to explore the nuanced realities they might otherwise oversimplify. Your existential awareness opens up conversations about meaning and purpose that can be profoundly healing and connecting. If this exploration of cognitive development has spoken to something deep in your experience, if you're ready to continue discovering insights that help you navigate the beautiful complexity of conscious existence, I invite you to continue this journey of understanding together. This is just one conversation in an ongoing exploration of what it means to develop and flourish as conscious beings. There are discoveries ahead about how these cognitive capabilities interact with emotional development, how they influence the capacity for intimacy and creativity, and how they can be cultivated and strengthened throughout adult life. Join us as we continue to explore the profound insights that emerge when we take consciousness seriously as both a developmental achievement and an ongoing creative project. Together, we can discover new ways to thrive in uncertainty, to find meaning in complexity, and to use our cognitive gifts in service of our deepest values and aspirations. Your consciousness is a miracle that deserves to be understood, celebrated, and continuously developed in community with others who share your commitment to growth and understanding. Next, we'll explore how Piaget's insights into cognitive development reveal why some people seem to effortlessly maintain intimate relationships, while others struggle with connection despite their best intentions, and how understanding the hidden cognitive foundations of emotional intimacy can transform your capacity for deep, lasting bonds with others.